Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to be looking at GraphQL Mutations. So I'm going to be using the API that I built in the last live stream I carried out. So this API basically has two types of data we are dealing with. We have users as well as posts. So right here, when I query for all posts, we can be able to see that we can return a user with their Actually, we are returning all users, and we have one user with a username and an email. So we can also query for their ID. When I try to query for this, we now return their ID. We can also be able to query for posts. So let me carry out a query for all posts. So I'm going to come here and query for all posts. Now, since this is a graph structure, we can be able to query for all ages, and then we query for a specific node. Now, each node is going to have a field, and in this case we can have the user ID, we can have the title of the post as well as the content, and now we can be able to return all the posts that we have for our API for now. But the problem with this API is the only thing we are doing is querying, and we need some way of being able to create and update our data. Now that's where mutations come in. Mutations are ways for GraphQL to allow a client to be able to create some data or be able to update some data that's existing on the backend. Now in this case, we're going to look at how we can implement GraphQL mutations using Graphene-Python. So let's get started. So here in my VS Code, I already have our schemas already defined for us. So we have a user schema that's having our DB model. Now, if you're wondering what this DB model is, it's an SQLAlchemy based model, and we already defined it having the fields of ID, username, email, and posts. Now, we also have that of post that has the title, the content, as well as the user ID. So using this, we're going to be using our mutations to be able to help us to add into the database that we created using SQLAlchemy. Now, if you're looking at my schemas and getting confused, I am actually using Graphene SQLAlchemy, and that's why I have that SQLAlchemy object type. So without further ado, let's look into how to create mutations. So I'm going to create our first mutation, which is going to be our user mutation. That's going to allow us to create users. So I'm going to begin by creating a simple class. And this class is going to be our user mutation. So I'll call it our user mutation. And this is going to inherit from graphene.mutation. Now that you have this, I'm simply going to go ahead, and the first thing I'll do is to define our arguments. So the arguments are the data that we're actually going to send with this query or with this request that are going to allow us to create our GraphQL or to create our data. So I'll begin by creating the class, and I'm going to call this class arguments, and it's not going to inherit from anything for now. So what we shall have are the different fields or the data that you want to send when creating a user. So when you go back to our database models right here, we have each user having a username as well as our email. Now these are the key fields that you may need when creating a user. So to keep it simple, I'm simply going to come right here and provide those as Graphene types. So I'm going to begin with our username. Now this username is actually going to be our Graphene string. So I'm going to begin by saying that this will be a Graphene string. Now we're also going to make this required by saying required is going to be equal to true. And once we have that, we're going to do the same thing for our email. Now I'm going to say that we shall have our email being graphene.string. And once we have this, we can also say that it's also required. So we can say required equals to true. And once we are done with this, now let's go ahead and be able to define what actually happens when creating a user. Now each time we're creating a mutation, we have to define a mutate method that describes what really happens with the data that we provide as our arguments. So I'm going to define that within here. So I'll come and say we're going to have a function that's going to be called mutate. It's going to take in self, and it will take in the following things. So we shall have info, we shall have our username, and we're also going to have our email. So once we have these things, we're going to create a new user based on these specific fields. Now we're going to have our username, and our username in this case, or actually we shall create a user. So our user is going to be of type user DB model, or that DB model that we actually have that exists as our database model. And this user will have a username. Now this username will be equal to the argument or the username we provide. So we're going to say our username is going to be our username. Now we should also have our email being equal to our email. And once we have this, now let's go ahead and define how we're going to create our user. So UserDB model is an SQLAlchemy based object. Now what we're going to do is to use our session to basically create our new user. So we shall begin by saying session.add, and then in this case we shall specify that we're adding our new user, and then you're going to basically finally commit this to a database using session.commit. Once we are done with this, let's go ahead and return what actually we want as a response after creating our user. So in this case, I'm going to come and say we're going to return, but actually, what are we actually returning? We are returning our user mutation. Now this user mutation is going to take in that field of a user. So we need to return a user with some predefined fields. Now we need to create that field of a user. So I'm going to come and create that as a field. And this user is actually going to be a field. So I'll just come and say graphene.field. We're going to return this as a field. And then we shall define the type. So I'm just going to come and say we're going to have a lambda that's going to return our user schema. So what happens is when we create this user, we want to return this user as our type of our user schema. We want to return this user in a way that we defined as our user schema. So if you're wondering which user schema I'm referring to, that's our user schema that we defined as our SQLAlchemy object type. Now I'm going to come right here, and all I have to do is to define this as user schema. And after doing this, now let's go ahead and create our main mutation class. So our main mutation class is going to define how we are actually going to create, or how we're actually going to attach this to our main schema, which we have right here. So that class is going to be a class, and we're simply going to call it mutation. And right now we are going to basically say this is going to be graphene dot, and instead of defining this as a mutation, we're going to define it as an object type class that's going to be attached to our schema. So I'm just going to come and say it's going to be graphene.object type. Now the fields we shall have here are going to be, so I'm just going to call this field mutate user or create user, and this is going to be of type our user mutation, and in this case it will be a field. So once we have this, now the remaining thing is to just attach our mutation we've created here for creating our users onto our main schema. Now shall just come and say that our mutation is actually going to be our main mutation class. So I'll just come and say we're going to provide our mutation. Now that this is done, let's go ahead and test our mutation. So hoping that our server is running, I am going to go ahead and check out our user interface here, which is called GraphQL. That's going to allow us to make use of our mutations. Now we've been just creating or querying our data right here and being able to get specific fields, but for this case we're going to actually create some data on our backend. So I'm going to remove this query, and then I'm going to try to refresh here. So after refreshing, I'm going to begin by stating that we're going to carry out a mutation. And now, since our mutation is already attached, it's going to be mutate user. And each time we have this mutation attached to our schema, GraphQL also gives us auto-completions to allow us to carry out this easily. So I'm going to say we're going to mutate user. Now we're going to provide our first argument, which is going to be our email. Now let's say this email is going to be johndoe@gmail.com. And let's say we also have the username, and this username is going to be John Doe. Now that we have this, now we're going to also define a field on this mutation, which we define to be our user field. And this is going to have our username. It's going to have our email, and we can also provide our ID. Now let's go ahead and try to run this query or run this mutation. Now when I press play, right now we're actually returning our data, but this data is null. And let's actually confirm whether our user has been created. So when I go back right here, I actually have a tool that's called DB Browser for SQLite, so that will investigate whether our user has been created. Now I'm going to open that tool and be able to open the database. So I'll go to open database, and then within our documents we have it located right here, which is our post database we are using for now. I'll open this, and when you go to browse data, we are going to go to our table of users, and now we have our user being created. It seems like the way we defined our return statement is wrong. So let's actually see what's happening. So when I go back right here, what I'm going to do is to check what we returned here. So this is actually returning a user mutation, but it's not returning a user we've created. So I'll come and specify that the user we want to have here is going to be equal to our user. So it's going to be the user we've created right here. And when I save, let's try to create the same user, or let's actually change our details here. So let's say it's going to be gender, and here we can actually have gender as well. Now when I press play, we now see that gender has been created, and we are actually returning an appropriate response. Now this is working, and I hope you guys are enjoying it. So the next thing we're going to do is to create a mutation for our posts. For now, we've been able to create data on our users. Even if we actually go ahead and query for all our users, now I'm going to just come and say querying for all our users. We're going to have ages, and then on each age we shall have nodes, and let's say we're going to get usernames. So when we get our usernames, we now see that we've created a third user called Jendo. Now this is working in a way that's nice, in a way that is actually interesting. Now let's go ahead and look at how we can be able to create a post, and this post actually has to belong to a certain user. So I'm going to go right here, and all I have to do is to create a mutation for our posts. So I'm going to create a class, and this class is going to be our post mutation. So once we have this is going to inherit from Graphene.mutation. And once we have this, then we are actually going to have our arguments. So I'll create a class, and this class is going to be a class of arguments. And once I have this, then the first thing we're going to provide is actually going to be the ID of the user who that post belongs to. So we shall have a field called our user ID, and this will be defined as our Graphene dot, in this case we shall say string, or actually this is actually going to be our integer. So I'll define it as Graphene.int. Now this will also be required, but I'll leave it like that. Another thing we're going to have is our title. So we shall have a title, and the title is going to be a string. So I'll just come and say that we shall have Graphene.string. And once you have this, you can actually say it's going to be required. So I'll leave it to true. And now we're also going to have our content. So I'm going to provide content, and here we shall have Graphene dot, in this case it's going to be a string, and shall also have it to be required. So I'll say required is equal to true. Now that we have this, let's go ahead and also define a field that's going to define how we shall return our post after creating it. So I'm just simply going to come here and say we shall have a post that's going to be a field, and we shall define that we're just going to return a type of our post schema that we defined right here. And I'm just simply going to come and do the same thing just like we did for our posts. So in this case, I'll define a lambda function, and this will return our post schema. Now that we have this, let's go ahead and define how we create our posts. So we're going to come create our mutate. We're going to create our mutate So it's going to take in self and then info, and then it will take in the various arguments. So we shall need the user ID. We shall also need our email, and we shall also need we shall need user ID, our title, sorry for that, as well as our content. And once we have this, then let's go ahead and create a post. So I'm just going to come and say that we shall have our new post being equal to a post, or what we actually refer to as a post DB. I actually recommend you check out the video. It's at the link in the top. So I'm actually going to say that this post is actually going to have a title, and this title is going to be the title provided as an argument. Now the next thing is going to be the content. So shall provide our content, and our content is going to be our content. But since you have a relationship between a user as well as a post, you also need to provide the user who created this post. Now if you go back to how we defined our database models, we defined this post to be author. So in this case, we have to specify that the author of a certain post is the author. So we're actually going to do that by coming right here and then saying that our author for this post. So let's say we're going to have author, and this is actually going to be blank for now. Let me actually just call it author. So we're going to carry out a query for the author who created that post based on the ID of the user. So I'm just simply going to come here, and all I have to do is create a variable called post. Now this will be a query. So we shall use our session, and then we shall query, in this case we shall query for our user. So this will be user DB model. If I'm not mistaken, it will be our user DB model, just like we imported it right here. So we shall have this as our user DB model, and in this case we shall filter by, so I'm actually just going to filter by the ID. So if we have the ID being equal to the user ID provided, then we shall need the first object. So now that we have this, I'm simply going to go ahead and save. And now let's go ahead and attach. So we've already attached this author to a specific post. Now let's go ahead and save this. So we shall use our session object to add this. So session.add, and then we shall add a new post. And then we shall finally commit this to our database. So I'll just say session.commit. And once we have this thing, I'm going to just simply go ahead and say that we're going to return our post mutation. And this post mutation is going to have our post being equal to our newly created post, which we called our new post. Now that you have this, I'll go ahead and save. So this actually pull up our server, which is actually running and has restarted. Now let's try to create a post basing on the mutation we've carried out here, but we have actually not attached this to our main mutation class. So I'll do that with mutate post, and then here I'll say that we shall have post. This will be our post mutation dot field, and then I'll go ahead and save. So when I save this, I'm going to head over to our GraphQL right here. And now in this case, let's actually try to create a mutation for creating our posts. So I'm simply going to come right here, and all I have to do is to remove this. Let me actually first refresh. So we actually have an error here, no app. So we actually have no app exception. Let me try to see. No module named PyTest. It seems like I have an issue with my imports here. So let me actually remove that session from PyTest. Okay, so when I save and refresh, all right, so I have no problems here. So what I'm going to do is to remove this, and once I remove this, so we're actually going to carry out a mutation. So I'll say mutation, and in this case we're going to mutate our post. Now since we have this as a mutation, it's going to take in some arguments. So we are going to have our title, and our title, let's say our title is going to be this is a sample post from mutation. Remember, in the live stream I actually created posts, but I was using SQLAlchemy. I'm actually going to also create I'll create, so this will be our content. And in this case, our content is actually going to be, this is content from mutation. And then I'll go ahead and also provide the user ID. So let's say we're going to have our user ID as 1. And I'm going to close this, and after closing this, then we're going to provide our field, which is actually going to be our post. And since you have this post, it's actually going to also have fields such as the content, the title, as well as the user ID. So let's try to use our mutations. When I press play, we now see that our session is not defined. I think we have a problem here. So let's actually see what's happening. So session is not defined. We actually used session.commit. So simply going to change this. And in this case, when we make a query, we now see that our post has actually been created. So I hope this video has shown you how mutations work. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment down in the description below. Actually in the comment section. I hope to see you in the next video. I'm going to be creating as many videos on GraphQL as possible so that we get to learn this interesting technology together. Thank you for watching, guys, and if you're new, please subscribe. I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.